Hi, I'm going to be explaining the physics of knitting. To understand knitting, we need to understand the two main components, the knit and the purl. When you knit, there are V-shaped patterns that are created, and when you purl, there are little bulbs that are created. The knit and the purl work together to create this whole stitch. The head is the purl, and then the arms are the knit. Tensional force, which is the physics force responsible for knitting, is defined as the pulling force that is axially pulled by means of a string, cable, chain, or a similar material. When you knit, the direction of the tension is always going to be up towards the head. And the net force is never zero because the yarn is only being pulled in one direction. So this is the problem because, for example, the stockinette stitch always curls. It curls inwards and it curls up. For many beginners, this is extremely frustrating because the stockinette stitch is one of the easiest stitches and the stitch that most people begin knitting with. Some beginner knitters will think that this is incorrect because they may think that the yarn is not supposed to curl when it is. So to solve this problem, we need to understand what makes a piece curl. Let's use the example of the garter stitch. This is the garter stitch. As you can see, you really only see the heads. But if you pull at it like this, you can see that in between each row of heads, there's also a row of arms. But as a whole, this piece does not curl. Even though the heads are being pulled towards each other, this does not count as curling. So to understand what this looks like, we can draw a diagram. So we have to look at the cross section between the back and the front. If this is the front and this is the back, then the tension is going up and over towards the head and the arms are in the back. This alternates in the garter stitch. Because as you can see, this row is a row of heads. But when you turn it over, it's actually a row of arms on the back. So the back always has the opposite component. So if the front are heads, the back are arms. If the front are arms, the backs are heads. So this sort of pattern is created. And the garter stitch is not curled because the tension is equalized. One is going towards the front, and the next row is going towards the back, and then the next row is going towards the front, and so on. So this equalizes the tension, which means that the piece won't curl. But if we look at the stockinette stitch, the front are all heads, or they're all arms. And if we draw a similar diagram, this stitch would look like this. If this is the front, this is the back, then all the tension will be going towards the front if the front are the heads. So if this were the front, then the tension would look like this. All of the tension is being pulled towards one side, and we can see a curling happening because there's no tension to pull it this way. In the garter stitch, the net force is zero. Because while one force is being pulled this way, the other one is being pulled this way. So net force is zero. But in the stockinette stitch, the net force is never zero. Because the tension is being pulled in one direction, and there's no force pulling in the other direction to equalize it. We can see this when we look at the curling. All of the force is being pulled this direction, up and over. Another example of a stitch that does not curl is the seated stitch. This is called the seated stitch because there are little nubs in between the arms, which gives it the look of seeds. The seated stitch would look like this in this sort of diagram. This looks extremely similar to the garter stitch. And because of this, both of these stitches lay completely flat. We can also look at this as a real life example. So if we look at this specific head, on the back is an arm. And this stays true throughout the whole thing. And for another example, this is the rib stitch. The rib stitch is made up of little sections or portions. Each one of these raised areas is a section or a portion. And then on the back, we can see the same thing. This piece does curl because if we stretch it out, we can see how wide it actually is. But if we let it go, it curls inwards. And each of these sections are raised, so it has it looks like a little bridge. This happens because each of these portions are stockinette stitch. The rib stitch is essentially a lot of stockinette stitches put together to create a wider or larger piece. So it would look like this. Let's say we had 3 purl stitches and then we switched to 3 knit stitches. That's what the rib stitch looks like. So it looks like this. So while the whole piece doesn't curl, because while there are 3 being pulled towards the front and then 3 being pulled towards the back, this individual portion will curl, but as a whole they will not curl because 3 here and 3 here equalizes. So while the net force is 0 throughout the whole thing, the net force of each individual portion is never 0, just like the stockinette stitch. So what's the solution to this problem? The solution is to knit with stitches where the net force is 0. For example, the garter stitch, the rib stitch, and the seated stitch. When you use these stitches, the piece will not curl. Or if you want to, you can even use a variation of these basic stitches. For example, you could do 2 knitted stitches and then 2 purling stitches. This would still create a flat piece, but it's a variation on the seated stitch. So any variation or the original stitch of the garter stitch, the rib stitch, and the seated stitch will create a flat piece. Thank you.